So item 2, Tunbridge Wells Electoral Review. Our speakers this evening will inform us about the review and their work over the next 2 years. And they are the Local Government Boundary Committee for England Commissioners. The lead commissioner for Tunbridge Wells is Amanda Nobbs. I hear that she's not joining us this evening, but I'd like to give a very warm welcome to Alison Everson, who is the Review and Programme Manager, and her colleague Yemi Fagan, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who is the Review Officer. So without any further delay, I'll hand straight over to Alison. Alison.
Many thanks, and it's really so wonderful to see so many people here this evening. Thank you all for coming. It's, I think, probably a record for this many people coming to one of these types of briefings, so we're really grateful that you're all here. So Yemi and I are here tonight just to talk to you for as long as you would like to hear from us, and we're happy to answer as many questions as you have. I'm going to do a short 20-30 minute presentation about the electoral review process, why the Commission is doing it, how you can get involved and how you can influence the outcome. There'll be, as we say, an opportunity for Q&A, and if we could just keep those questions until the end, we'll go through this presentation and then we'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. My name is Alison Everson. I am the Review and Programme Manager at the Commission. Yemi Fagan is the Review Officer. She'll be the main point of contact for the review process. And if you've got any questions throughout the next year or so, we'd be very happy to speak to any of you at any point. So first, a little bit about the Local Government Boundary Commission. What we do is we recommend fair electoral and boundary arrangements for England. We are completely impartial. We don't report to government or any political parties. We actually report directly to Parliament via a committee chaired by the Speaker. We're objective. Our recommendations for new electoral arrangements are only based on the evidence related to the criteria that are set out in law. We're transparent. We follow clear and open processes. We put submissions that we receive about the review, the representations that people make, and publish them on our website, appropriately redacted, so that people can see how we've reached our decisions. And we also publish detailed reports that explain our reasoning. We're responsive. We do really listen to local opinion, and we regularly change our recommendations based on what we've heard from local people. So we will publish draft recommendations after our first consultation, and in over 95% of cases we change between draft and final. So that's on the basis of what we hear during those consultations. So we really do listen to what people say. We're professional and accessible, very easy to get hold of. There's only 23 officers at the Commission, so there's only one Alison, one Yemi. If you call our switchboard, you'll get hold of us at any point, and we'll be happy to assist you in any way that we can. So what is an electoral review and why are we here? So an electoral review considers the electoral arrangements for a local authority. In this case, we're looking at Tunbridge Wells. And this means we look at the following things and only these things. So we're looking at the total number of councillors for Tunbridge Wells, the total number of wards, the location of the boundaries between each of those wards, the names of the wards, and the number of councillors elected to each of those wards. At the end of our review, at the end of the Commission's review, we will make recommendations to Parliament about each of these things in time to be implemented for the next election. So why are we here in Tunbridge Wells? Well, we as a Commission have got a responsibility, which is set out in law, to review every local authority in England from time to time. That's the phrase that they use in the legislation. Tunbridge Wells hasn't had a review since 2001. So by the time this review is complete, the current boundaries that you have will have been in place for 21 years. So the Commission thinks that it's really time for a review of Tunbridge Wells to be taken. We're also here because there are some poor levels of electoral equality in the authority. So some councillors represent a lot more or a lot fewer electors than others. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, as this is one of the key criteria that we look at when we're drawing up wards. So our review process is split into 4 phases. So phase 1 is the phase which considers councillor numbers. During this stage, the Commission carefully considered the evidence it received after briefing members of the council and decided that Tunbridge Wells should have 39 councillors, which is 9 fewer than there are now. Following this council size stage, we then move on to our current phase of the review, which is about the warding arrangements. So during this stage, we want to consult with yourselves, and which is why it's so fantastic so many of you here this evening, and so that we can set up a new pattern of wards across the whole borough. Once we propose our final recommendations for new wards, we go through a parliamentary process to make the new arrangements law. And then the last phase is implementation, which refers to the election at which the new wards are used for the first time. As I say, we're currently in phase 2 of the process, and I'll talk a little bit more about how this stage works, what we're looking for, and how you can get involved. So the warding phase of the review process is really based on a lot of consultation with people living and working in Tunbridge Wells. Parish councils and community groups are really important, so it's really encouraging that, as I heard tonight, there's some residents associations and residents groups here as well. We know that there are 16 parish and town councils, I think, across Tunbridge Wells. We don't know Tunbridge Wells anywhere near as well as the people that live here, and we will never do so. So we're really relying on you and people who live here to give us your views on a pattern of wards that make the most sense for Tunbridge Wells. There'll be at least 2 opportunities for people to give their views about where the ward boundaries should go and what the ward should be called. So the first opportunity to do so is now. The consultation period is open. It runs until the 21st of March. And during this time, we're asking people across Tunbridge Wells to tell us where you think the new ward should go. People can tell us about whole of Tunbridge Wells if you'd like, but we're also really equally happy to hear ideas just about areas that you know really well, your patch, the neighbourhoods, areas within Tunbridge Wells towns, particular parishes, just anything that you know about, you can tell us about just those areas. We'll talk about the kind of evidence and information that the Commission will find helpful in just a moment. So once the first consultation period is closed, we'll go through all of the submissions and evidence. We'll come to Tunbridge Wells, COVID restrictions permitting. We'll drive around, we'll walk around, we'll look at how the different proposals that we've received fit together on the ground. And then we'll come up with a set of draft proposals based on what we've heard. We'll then publish those draft proposals, we'll consult on them, and we'll give everybody a chance to tell us what we've got right, what we've got wrong, and what we should change. I'll just mention it here, we might say it again later, but if in our draft recommendations we get something right, please do tell us where we've got it right, because it's natural as human instinct to tell us where we've got things wrong. But that sometimes means that if we've got it right, people don't tell us because they just think that that will be what happens next. And then perhaps it's a vocal minority that tells us that we've got it wrong and we don't change it and we make changes when actually we should have stuck with our draft recommendation. So tell us what we've got right as well as telling us what we've got wrong. So the second consultation runs if there are no delays, from the 5th of July until the 12th of September this year. We'll publish maps and reports on our website, and we'll send you links to them all, outlining how we reached our draft proposals so people can understand how we came up with them. Once that second consultation has closed, we'll go away, read everything again, assess everything that you've told us, make any changes we've been persuaded to make, and then publish our final recommendations in November. Once the final recommendations have been published, they're set, they can't be changed after that point. There is just one area where we might have the opportunity before those final recommendations to move away from that process that I've just set out, and that is if we are persuaded to hold a third round of consultation. We might want to do that just to test some of the suggestions we received during that second consultation. If they're very different from what we originally proposed and we really feel like we need to test them again with people in the area. That further consultation is usually just restricted to 1 or 2 areas if it's needed, but it can really help us clarify our thinking if we receive some persuasive alternatives during that second round of consultation. So when you're telling us your views, there are some key things you should know. We're bound by law to consider the arguments related to 3 things when drawing up new wards, and we call these our statutory criteria. And I just welcome you when you walk away from this meeting, is just to bear in mind these criteria when you're making your proposals to us, because the Commission will always come back to them. They're not ranked in any way, so no one criteria is more important than the other, and it's the Commission's job to balance them all. So the first criteria I'm going to talk about is electoral equality, and that means that we will seek to propose wards that will mean that each councillor represents roughly the same number of electors. We don't demand obviously perfect electoral equality, because that's just never going to happen. It's not realistic. But it's really important, most of all, it's really important that the wards we propose reflect local communities and that they use clear boundaries that are recognisable and identifiable. Which brings us to our other 2 criteria. So community identities and interests, and obviously this is where we really want to hear from you. We seek to propose wards that keep communities together and reflect the shape of local communities in the area. And finally, effective and convenient local government. And this just means we try to propose wards that are coherent, they use sensible boundaries, they've got broadly good internal road links, and that they have names which mean something to local people. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about each of those, but before we go on, it's just to really emphasise that these 3 criteria aren't ranked in one way. It's about balancing all of those things together. So if you can put yourself in our shoes and try and make sure that when you make your proposals to us, it's balancing all those criteria. We need to make a proposal that fits across the whole of Tunbridge Wells, and we really need to make sure that we can balance the criteria across the whole area. A quick note on the number of councillors per ward, because I know that that is really important in Tunbridge Wells, and there is a change in what the pattern that you have now will be. Tunbridge Wells elects by thirds, and that means in the legislation, which has changed since your last review, that there is a presumption that there should be a uniform pattern of 3-member wards. And I know that that is different, that you've got a combination of 1-member, 2-member and 3-member wards. So the Commission will look and welcomes a uniform pattern of 3-member wards being submitted to us, and that's what we'll be looking to propose. We are able to move away from a uniform pattern of 3 members if it transpires that we can't provide for a good balance in our statutory criteria with a uniform pattern. In those circumstances, we might have a mixed pattern, say a couple of 1 or 2-member wards in an area, but 3-member wards in most places. An example I can give you is in St Albans, where we did a review recently, and we found that we couldn't actually come up with a uniform pattern of 3-member wards that we felt really did balance the criteria. So the Commission, and I don't think we actually received proposals from anybody locally, but the Commission took a decision to move away from those 3-member wards. But it is quite rare. Our starting point for the review, because of that legislation, is that we will seek to deliver a uniform pattern of 3-member wards. I'm going to pass over to Yemi now, who's going to talk to you a little bit more first about electoral equality and our other statutory criteria. Thanks, Yemi.
Thank you, Alison, and thanks to everyone for coming. Now I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about what we mean by electoral equality. So ideally, every councillor would represent the same number of electors, And in a perfect world, it would look like something that's on the screen. However, in reality, over time, a number of things can happen in Tunbridge Wells, for instance, which will alter the number of electors different councillors represent. So one example is you might see a number of houses built in some wards, which will bring new electors to some wards, but not others. And even then, not in equal amounts. You could have a university or high rates of registration in one part of the local authority, and that will also bring a high number of new electors to one or a few wards, depending on the distribution. You could have some people leave the area, which again will alter the number of electors in some, but not all wards. And you might have people moving from one part of the borough to another. So you can see how an area might become imbalanced over time. And we as a commission will try to ensure that this imbalance does not occur again too quickly. So to do that, we've worked with the council's officers to come up with a set of electorate forecasts for each polling district in the area. And the idea behind this is to try to future-proof electoral equality for each of the wards. And for that, we propose, for a period 5 years after the end of the review, and that's set out in legislation. So for Tunbridge Wells, the forecast year is 2027. Now, the forecasts for Tunbridge Wells have been published on our website, and our aim is to propose a set of wards that all have electoral variances within 10% of the average for Tunbridge Wells by 2027. Now we move on to our second criteria, and that's community identities and interests. Now, as Alison mentioned earlier, it's really important to the Commission in proposing new wards to reflect local communities. And you know your areas far better than us, than we would ever know them. And so we're relying on yourselves to tell us about the shape of local communities and how they should be reflected within any warding pattern. Now, we know that a sense of community is often shaped by the amenities and services that people use, as well as local groups and organizations. And these community facilities could be shops, they could be schools or other places of education, they could be residents' associations and other community groups, sports facilities, or places of worship. So telling us about how you use these facilities and amenities and how relevant they are to your sense of place helps us to understand where communities exist and how to draw boundaries that reflect them. Additionally, quite often, and this is really important for us and where you can help us during the consultation period. So quite often, what looks like a dividing feature on a map is actually a uniting feature to a community. And we've got an example to share with you from a recent review we had in Rochdale. Now on screen, you can see that there appears to be a clear dividing line on the map, and it's just highlighted in red along the black boundary line. Now, during our first consultation, we didn't hear much about communities in this area in Rochdale. And so we went with what we thought was the stronger boundary as part of our draft proposals. Now, during the second consultation, we heard the exact opposite. And local people wrote in to tell us that the patches of land along the black boundaries did not separate communities, but were actually nature reserves that were a uniting feature for the people that lived on both sides. And so what we had done with our draft recommendations was actually divided their sense of community. And on screen now are some examples of the kinds of things that we were told, with pictures of the nature reserve and an online community dedicated to the preservation of these areas for local people. So we were persuaded to change our draft recommendations as a result of this to make sure that we were not splitting a community with our warding proposals. And on screen is the change that we made to the map. And you can see that that black boundary is no longer the same. Now, moving on to our third and final criteria, and that is convenient and effective local government. So here we look for strong boundaries, strong and identifiable, recognizable boundaries that make sense on the ground, and for ones that should make it easy as possible for councillors to represent their areas. We also look for names that mean something to local, so ward names that mean something to local people. And here is a good example of a motorway that goes right through an authority area. Now, using this as a boundary would provide for a good reflection for convenient and effective local government. So any submissions you make to us should therefore consider these three criteria and balance them out. In particular, please tell us about your communities and how they can best be reflected in any pattern of wards. And please always give us a reason for something that you're proposing. So tell us why you're proposing it and how it addresses any one or three or all of those three criteria. If you want a particular boundary in a particular area, don't tell us, just tell us you want the boundary, but tell us why you want the boundary and how it addresses, our criteria. Now we have some very specific rules about parishes during an electoral review. So we can't create or abolish parishes as part of an electoral review. So we will not change the boundaries of any of your parishes as part of this review. That would be done as part of a community governance review, which is the responsibility of the local authority. So the council will have to do that after our review. Now, we cannot amend the external boundaries, as I mentioned, of any parishes as part of this review. And again, that can only be done through a community governance review. So we don't create or abolish parishes, and neither do we amend the boundaries. If we draw a ward boundary, as in a district or borough ward boundary through a parish, we have to create a parish ward. And this is what we mean by that. So assume on screen now, you've got a parish. So if we were to draw a brand new boundary through that parish, and that is the red boundary there, in the middle of the parish, if we were to draw that through a parish in the way you see on screen, which creates a ward on either side, we would have to create a parish ward. Each of the constituent sides will become a parish ward. And we will always write to every parish council at the start of every consultation stage. And if your parish is affected or warded by anything that we do, we will write to you and give you a map as well. Now, there are also some common examples of arguments that we hear during our consultations, but those that we cannot take into account. And I'll go through some of them here. Firstly, Alison mentioned that we are not affiliated to any political party. We are independent, and we are not interested in which party could be elected in any proposed ward. So we do not look we do not look at political consequences of any warding pattern. Now, we can't take into consideration if it ain't broke, don't fix it, because over 30% of the wards in Tunbridge Wells have electoral inequality. And so that means that we have to fix that. And also the map will have to change to accommodate a different number of councillors, and to achieve electoral fairness. So again, we can't take into consideration if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that process of trying to address the electoral inequalities and different number of councillors is going to have a knock-on effect across the whole council area. So the status quo is not a viable option. Again, parliamentary boundaries, we cannot take them into consideration. If you think about it, wards are used to build up parliamentary constituencies, not the other way around. And secondly, parliamentary boundaries are dealt with under a separate set of rules and by a different body. Our review won't change postcodes. As far as we have seen, Our review will have no impact on house process or insurance premiums. And finally, this review is only concerned with the internal ward boundaries for Tunbridge Wells. We are not able to amend the external boundaries between Tunbridge Wells and any adjoining authorities as part of this review. So this is an electoral review for Tunbridge Wells only, the internal ward boundaries of the council. Now, on to phase 3. After warding pattern, once that phase is finished and we have published our final recommendations, we will turn these proposals into law by presenting them to Parliament. So what we do is we lay an order in both houses of the Commons and Lords and for scrutiny. And once that order is laid, it goes through something called the draft negative resolution procedure, which just simply means that it has to sit in Parliament for 40 sitting days without any objection. Now, it's important to say that Parliament can only reject or agree our recommendations. It cannot make any amendments to the orders. So it has to agree them as a whole or in its entirety or reject them. And it's just important to note that none of our orders have been rejected since the LGBC was set up in 2010. Finally, if no objection is made, it automatically becomes law. And final phase is implementation. And then these new electoral arrangements will be implemented at an all-out election in the subsequent election in 2024. So once we've completed our review and the order has been made, in 2024, that first election will be an all-out one to bed in the new arrangements. Now, I'll just go through the timetable very quickly. So we had a preliminary period where we sought information from the council and agreed a forecast, and that ended in December. In January, we announced the new council size, and then we started a consultation on warding pattern, which, as Alison mentioned, will end on the 21st of March. Once we've received all the submissions for that, we will look at them, consider them, and publish. The Commission will publish draft proposals in July. And then that will launch our second consultation, which will run to the 12th of September. Finally, we'll look at everything, and unless we decide to carry out a further set of consultation, we will actually aim to publish our final recommendations on the 29th of November. Then we'll move to phase 3, and parliamentary approval should all have been completed by the spring of 2023. And the implementation will be, as I mentioned, in 2024. Now, there are lots of ways to make a submission over the course of our consultation period. You can email us, you can actually write us and post a letter to us or postcard or anything. You can go to our website or use a consultation portal. The consultation portal is open at the moment for Tunbridge Wells. You can actually send in your submissions and type them directly onto our website. You don't need to even email us in that respect. You can use the portal. It has some maps which will show you the existing wards for Tunbridge Wells, because we haven't come up with any proposals. So it will show the existing wards and the existing population, or electorate rather, of Tunbridge Wells, which you can then look at the roads and decide where you want to draw, propose your new ward boundaries. We are active on social media, and you can actually call us and, as Alison mentioned, ask for Alison or myself, and we are at the end of the phone. And thanks to everyone for coming and listening. And I think I'll hand back over to the chair. It's time for questions.
Yes, thank you both for that comprehensive account of who you are, what you do, the process and the way you work. And it's also encouraging to hear how we can all get involved. That is really good. I had been wondering about parish boundaries and parish boundaries and and for parliamentary boundaries. And thank you very much for answering those in the course of your presentation. I'm just going to have a look here at the chat box. I did look as we went along. Shall I scroll back to the beginning? Ben Chapelyard, did you have anything you wanted to ask? No. Right, I think that first one is Elizabeth. I think that's been answered, your question there. It's has it been decided for 39?
No, I don't think it has really, because it's the actual letter that was published said they're minded to, but now this seems to be being changed into they have decided that, and it will be useful to know which it is.
That's a very good question, and one that I'm happy to answer. So it's the Commission has taken a decision on the information that it's been given that it thinks that there should be 39 members for Tunbridge Wells in the future. When I was speaking earlier, you'll have heard me say that I thought there might be an opportunity in some places where we might be able to move away, or there might be a reason to move away from a uniform pattern of 3-member wards. That sometimes might mean that we, if there were to be a 2-member ward proposed, instead of trying to have a 2 and a 1-member ward, we might reduce the council size by 1, or we might increase the council size by 1 or 2 to facilitate a warding pattern. So the Commission believes that 39 is the right number of councillors for Tunbridge Wells, but to facilitate a warding pattern that balances those statutory criteria that I talked about, we might just adjust that number by 1 or 2. Sometimes that's around making sure that a town is represented, or a large village is represented appropriately with maybe 1 or 2 members, but it may be that we just can't quite tweak the boundaries under the council size that we've proposed. So we might just change it by 1 or 2 members, and that facilitates the best warding pattern across the whole area. We do that quite rarely. It's something I would say we probably do that in 1 out of 6 or 7 reviews. And it's really just where the distribution of the electorate and the parish boundaries come up that we can't facilitate the pattern. But if you just adjust the council size by 1 or 2, we can make it work better.
Right, thank you. Adrian, have you anything to add to your question about the boundaries coinciding with the existing unparished area?
Only that you'll be aware that the unparished area of the borough is quite a substantial part of the whole, and it'd be quite useful to be able to keep that boundary in place, and I think that's something that the town forum would like to happen, because otherwise we then end up with having to change the parish boundaries. So you could decide the wards within that boundary, but will it be possible to keep that boundary as is, or are they going to necessarily need to be changed to the boundary with the parished areas rather than the unparished area?
So let me just check that I understand that right. So we can't change the boundaries of the parishes. The town of Tunbridge Wells is unparished, but it's surrounded by parishes. Right. And therefore, because we can't change the parish boundaries, there's only that unparished area, and therefore we can't change that either. So that area will not change. The external boundaries, which are bounded by parishes, we won't touch that. Okay, so you won't. So the wards will be within the existing parishes. So the wards may go. We may create a ward which goes over the town of Tunbridge Wells and includes a parish from outside of Tunbridge Wells. I don't know. That is something that is within our, we have the ability to do that, but it depends on what people tell us. It may be that people say, actually, it's really sensible that you keep all of the wards within the town of Tunbridge Wells, within Tunbridge Wells, and that you shouldn't cross over and have any parishes within a district ward. But we will listen to what people tell us. It might be sometimes in an authority, there's a town that works very closely with a parish council outside of the town, and we create a district board that includes part of a town and a parish from outside.
Okay.
It really depends on what you tell us and how we
Okay.
can balance those criteria.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Hugo Pound next. I think your question may already be answered about potential for exemptions from three-member wards. Is that answered, or have you anything to add to that?
I just wanted to know, Alison, good evening, Alison and Yemi. I wanted to just ask again, if a local area could anticipate its voter population by 2027 as 4,400 rather than 6,600, which is what you're working to on the three-person wards, and were able to define their special characteristics as I've described there, there is still the potential for them as parish councils or just as local communities to advocate for a two-member ward or possibly even a one-member ward. Can you just confirm that? I'm thinking particularly of the centre of Paddock Wood, for instance, which could be very discreetly defined as a clear community, and also Rust Hall, which is also clearly defined as a specific community.
Yeah, I mean, I think the starting point is always that we're looking for a uniform pattern of three-member wards. If we can't find that, and you can persuade us that there really is a discrete community, and it might be very clearly bounded by a rural area outside of it, a topography, there might be a river or a very clear road that says it really would not make sense to combine this community with a part of another community in a three-member ward. If you can tell us, and the electorate and the distribution of the electorate really makes sense for just a one or a two-member ward, that is the only occasion that we would move away from the uniform pattern of three-member wards, which we're obliged to try and recommend. But you know, we did it ourselves in St Albans. I think quite often people think that it will be the Commission who's much more kind of hard-lined about the uniform pattern of three-member wards, but actually in St Albans, for example, we really thought it made no sense. I think it was the town of Harpenden, made no sense to take out 300 or 400 electors from the town of Harpenden and include them with 2 or 3 very rural parishes outside. We thought that makes no sense. We're going to have a two-member ward instead. So that's what we did there. But it doesn't come up that very often because we can often balance the criteria, but you're absolutely welcome to tell us about where you think an alternative to three-member wards would work, and we'll listen to what you tell us.
Yeah, thank you. Hugh Patterson, you raised the issue of accommodating the local plan. Would you like to put your question?
Yes, thank you. It's not clear, obviously, the local plan proposals put loads of houses on 2 parishes, one of which, Capel, is quite small, and will radically alter the population. And I can't see whether the proposals will actually take those into account, whether 2027, presumably, if the proposals are accepted, and we don't want them, that will just be getting going. But in 2 or 3 years after that, the boundaries will presumably be completely out of date.
I think in terms of what we use and what we find as a helpful forecast, the 5-year forecast the legislation says that we have to have regard to, which takes us to 2027, is quite helpful, although the recommendations that we're going to put in place are going to last 20 years or so until we come back and do another review. If we look for a forecast that is only 2 years, we're not into the future, we're not future-proofing it. If we look much beyond 5 years, it's even more likely to be out of date. So we're quite happy that 2027 is the right year. When your when the officers of Tunbridge Wells came up with the electorate figures, we asked them to really be reasonable and think about who will actually be not only living in the areas across Tunbridge Wells, but who will be registered to vote, because we're talking about electors, not just population. So it's trying to get the balance, recognising that there will, of course, be developments that happen. The local plan, who knows what will happen when things come in, whether things are called, decisions are called. it is about what is reasonable, and whether or not that is likely to happen, we can't confirm. In fact, the only thing that we really know about a forecast is that it won't be entirely accurate. So the figures that we've got, we want to keep in place, and we want to use them throughout the whole review, because even if developments we know that are included in the developments for the review aren't going to any longer take place, or there are developments that are taking place that weren't captured, we can't keep changing the figures as we go through. We need to kind of draw a line so that everybody is using the same forecast figures, and that we've got some certainty as we go through the process.
Thank you. Ray Moon, Paddock Wood, you've got a question there. Can I leave it to you to put it now?
Thank you. Hello, Alison. Paddock Wood and I think Capel is quite a different situation when you look across trying to achieve the equality in the electoral process, what you're trying here. Because the draft local plan is crucial, because if you look at the numbers for those two rural communities, really, they're a lot different than the urban communities that you're dealing with. And if you're trying to get that balance, it's near enough not achievable in those rural areas. Because if you're going to make the ward system maybe larger in Paddock Wood, we will then be going into the existing parishes which you're working with. So if we go into them, you make them smaller, so you may have to venture out to be able to do that. So I just have this concerns that you're not, with the draft local plan and the existing number of houses being built in Paddock Wood, we will not achieve that equality. Now, I think the argument is that if you extend the implementation to take into account and to make that more achievable of making a futuristic assessment, maybe, you will be more accurate in doing that. But if you set that to one side, it certainly will not, and it will be very unfair in the rural communities rather than in urban communities in Tunbridge Wells.
I mean, it is one of the trickiest things about a review like this, where there is development. We were doing a review in, we're in the middle of a review in Mid Sussex, and they've got similar challenges where there's development taking place. I mean, one tactic that you might think about when you're making proposals to us is, if you know there is likely to be development that takes place beyond 2027, is make a proposal to us where the variances, the forecast variances, excuse me, are for there to be fewer electors than the average for the ward that you're proposing. So as development takes place, the electoral equality, the number of electors per councillor gets closer to the average. And then as the development takes place, there will be more electors than the average.
Yeah, I know it's a dilemma for yourselves. I know that. But because when we make contributions like this, you think, well, you know, we may not be able to do that. See, the problem with that is that if you leave it that time, the next review will not take into account those changes. So even when you implement this, it will not be equality across the wards. So my argument would be that you put flexibility in there, maybe in the first instance. But if you know development is round the corner, which would increase the electoral numbers, then you could build that in and be closer to achieving what you want in 27.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, it's so hard to know which of the developments that you hope and think are going to take place, or you hope and think aren't going to take place. Will, you know, what will happen? We don't know. That's why we've got just a 5-year forecast. It's what the legislation says. We think it's actually not a bad forecast figure because it's not so far into the future. And to be honest, when the Commission takes its decisions, it will look just at what the electoral equality is for 2027. So within, as Yemi said, that 10% range for the average for Tunbridge Wells. So if there is going to be development beyond it, then, you know, take that into account and recommend a smaller ward, smaller in terms of the electorate to begin with, so that any development that comes in later can be accounted for. If we get it wrong, if those forecasts and those developments don't take place at the rate at which they're intended to, it may mean that the Commission does come back. It may mean that we have to do a kind of a smaller scale review in some areas. It's not something we've done before, but it is an option that is open to us within the legislation that we work with. So,
well, one
yeah.
final comment, then I take that. I accept what you're saying, but don't forget that the pressure on the government is to build more houses, and you can only do that in the rural areas, and that's a good bet. Whatever you're putting your money on, that would be a good bet, and it'd be a good bet. It would be in the areas of Paddock Wood and Capel. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. I think Peter Lidston, I think your question has been answered in the course of the chat. I'm conscious of the time passing, so if that's okay, Peter, we'll move on. Councillor Rodney Atkins, I think that one we've also discussed, or would you like to add anything?
No, that's lovely, thank you.
Yeah, okay. And again, Councillor Alan McDermott has kindly answered the question. Now then, Councillor Becky Bruno, KCC, would you like to put your question?
Yes, thank you. Well, will this year's elections be classed as by-elections then? Or are there regulations or statutory requirements for the council to inform the electorates of the change, whereas there will be an all-out, I'm guessing an all-out election in 2024, from what you were saying? How does that impact the elections this year? Thanks.
I mean, I think it's probably a question really for colleagues at the Tunbridge Wells Council to answer, but the recommendations of this commission won't come into effect until 2024. So effectively, until that point, everything remains the same. So there was everything carries on as normal until we make the order. Nothing changes. But your colleagues at Tunbridge Wells Council might want to come in there.
Or to discuss it informally later, perhaps. Robert, Chris, your question, please confirm that May the 24th election is all out, followed by thirds from 2025 onwards. Is there anything to add to that, Robert, Chris?
Well, just to simply confirm that it's, when I say all out, it's all out in all the wards, because of course, customarily, we do have some smaller wards that do not go to the poll every year. So the impression I have from what you're saying is that effectively 2024 sees a brand new fresh start with a whole new slate, the third start again. I just wanted to confirm that was the case.
Yes, it is.
That's the case. 2025 won't be the first election, though. It will be 26 because 25 is the county election year. So that's your fallow year. So all out in 2024 and then from thirds again from 26 onwards.
Okay. Linda, you have an S there. Please put your question.
Yes, I do. Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Don, and good evening, Alison. Yes, I have a question about the rural areas, because they are very different, of course, from, as you probably know, from the urban areas. Is it likely that some parishes in the rural areas are more likely to retain 2 councillors or even 1 councillor? Because if the increase is to 3 in the rural areas, you'll get that means they're going to, in some places, they're going to have to cover 3 entirely disparate villages, which have no historical connection in any way, and are scattered, and the distances between them are sometimes quite large as well in the rural areas. So that was my first question. And the second question is, Well, it's a statement really, I suppose, is that you spoke about planning and development, if the development of houses is likely to go beyond 2027. We are in planning at the moment, planning up to 2035, and we have a very, very large number of houses. And most of them are not going into Tunbridge Wells town. A very, very large number of them are going into the rural areas. And that really needs to be taken into account, I think. Because I can't understand, in a way, I can't understand why 20 years ago, when there was a review then, we were allowed to have 48 councillors, given that we're going to have about 30 or 40,000 extra inhabitants or residents once all this development has taken place by 2035. Anyway, could I have a response, please? Thank you.
In terms of the rural areas, I mean, it is a change in Tunbridge Wells. There will be inevitably larger wards, and inevitably there will be more parishes within each of those 3-member wards. It's really up to what you tell us in terms of whether or not we move away from a uniform pattern of 3-member wards in rural areas. If we can't come up with that pattern that reflects the criteria, if we can't get a 3-member ward that's got good electoral equality, reflects community identity, and has got good, strong boundaries, then we may well move away from it. But it's really what you tell us, and it is an outlier, as I say. We won't be doing that simply because it's a rural area and simply because it feels too large. We'll have to go beyond, I think, that description of a ward feeling too big. It would have to be really that a 3-member ward would be linking disparate areas which really don't have any connection together, and that we're not able to create a ward that, you know, does reflect communities and does have electoral equality and does have those good boundaries. So it's what you tell us. We will look and come to Tunbridge Wells. We will look at what we think can be facilitated, you know, where the distribution of electors is. But if you tell us that certain parishes can only have, that the statutory criteria can only be reflected in a certain ward, then tell us that and we will be persuaded by it. I don't know what it will be. I just know that in my experience, we have that uniform pattern in mind and we move away from it where we can't reflect it. In terms of the planning, we will map out where there is development planned. I know that there is quite a lot planned. We've got maps of where it's going to be. In terms of the future, I mean, I think that's really beyond my pay grade, as it were, and beyond the Commission's role and responsibility. We're looking just for the period that we're looking at in 2025. It may be that we come back and do a review more often. It's been 20 years since we did the last review. Depending on what happens in Tunbridge Wells, it may be that we come along and we look again at those boundaries. But we really are trying to focus on making sure that each elector has got fair representation in the developments, taking into account the developments by that 5-year forecast period.
Yeah, thank you very much, Linda, for that. Your question. Just moving on, again, I'm conscious of time, but so I don't think we can accept any more chat questions. Let's just run through these. Robert Chris's question, election by thirds. So what wards are up for election in 2024? Isn't that just a question of following the cycle through, or have I missed something there?
Yeah, so it's everybody out in 2024 and then into thirds after that.
Everybody in 2024 and
yeah,
thirds after that.
Yeah.
I see. All right, thank you. And finally, from Robert Wormington, does the review look at polling districts or is it purely whole ward boundaries?
So polling districts are just to administer your elections. And there'll be a polling district review that the council will undertake after we've done our review. So those polling districts will fit into the ward boundaries that we recommend. So we don't think polling districts really reflect communities. So we much prefer people to look at parishes to tell us where the parishes work together, because we think that they're the building blocks of communities. Polling districts just help people run the elections. So that will happen afterwards. We'll do the ward boundaries, and then the council will look at putting in polling districts to run the elections after that.
Right. I thought I had gone through all the questions, but suddenly I'm scrolling down and there are many, many more. Difficult to know where to go at this point. Yeah. I think I might know the answer to this one myself. David Riley asks, can ward boundary recommendations be extended into other council boundaries, Tunbridge or Maidstone's jurisdiction, for example?
Yemi, do you want to pick that one up?
So this electoral review is just for Tunbridge Wells. We won't be looking at any areas outside of the boundaries of Tunbridge Wells Council itself. So the ward boundaries will not extend beyond the boundaries of Tunbridge Wells Borough Council.
Okay. I will read this out because time is short. Elizabeth Aikenhead, I hope I got that right. Is it sensible, useful for a parish council to describe the community identities and interests and boundaries without actually proposing what the whole arrangement of boundaries within the borough should be?
Yes, absolutely. You don't need to come up with a pattern of wards, but if you tell us X parish and Y parish work together because of X, Y, and Z, we'll have that information to use. That's exactly the information we want. If we get loads of information, we layer it up together, we'll have a really good understanding of how communities in Tunbridge Wells work, and then we can come up with a pattern of wards. You don't need to be experts. Just tell us where you feel your communities are, and if you can tell us why you feel like that, that's really helpful. And if you can get the word out to tell lots of people to tell us that, we will really kind of understand the granularities of the communities, and that's what we really want from you. So yes, please do tell us exactly that.
All right. Councillor Rodney Aikens, I think your question has been answered by first question. There's another question from you. Currently, the electoral ward is around 1,750 for Tunbridge Wells. The wards after review are nearer to 2,400 per ward. Is this the magic number you are looking for?
Yemi, do you want to go through the magic numbers?
So yes, the elector councillor ratio, so the number of electors ideally that each councillor should represent is about 2,352, yes, close to 2,400. And you are allowed, plus or minus 10%. So we're not looking for absolute electoral equality, but we are looking for something within plus or minus 10% of that number per councillor. So if it's a 3-member ward, it's multiplied by 3 for that ward.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the questions. I would like to thank you both very much for your presentation, answering all our questions, explaining how you operate, your procedure, and giving an appropriate timeline as well. Also, once again, I would like to thank the Borough Council for making us the Town Forum, the platform under which this presentation, your excellent presentation, and the discussion and questions tonight has taken place. Very, very many thanks indeed to you both, Alison and Yemi. Thank you.
Many thanks for having us, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.
Thank you very much.